Hello, friends. This is Paavo Järvi in my 5th week of isolation. It's hard to believe that 5 weeks have already passed. And I hope that you are all well, and I hope that you're all healthy and find this time productive somehow and useful and maybe fulfilling in some way. Maybe in a way that you never thought before. For this particular little talk, I thought, why not choose a composer that obviously is very dear to my heart, and everybody seems to know who he is, and yet worldwide there is some sort of skepticism about where Sibelius actually stands. And certain countries have a very strong Sibelius tradition. Other countries are simply not performing it at all. And what is the reason that a giant like Sibelius is still not universally accepted by some of the musicians in some parts of the world? Feel free to ask me questions and let's discuss. I want to start with a little story that was in my years as a music director of Orchestre de Paris. And this is an orchestra, really great orchestra, but not very used to playing Sibelius. And of course, the violin concerto is something that everybody plays all the time. But then the symphonic pieces, if we take away the second symphony and perhaps the fifth, they don't appear so often on the programs. What I also noticed is that there is a little sort of puzzlement. People don't quite understand sometimes how Sibelius works, and they are left with a little bit of a question mark. Is that where the phrase going? Where the phrase is going? Is that the right expression for it? And then, of course, the first thing that comes to help is the recordings, and the recordings are plenty. There are plenty of great interpretations of, and very varied interpretations of recordings. And one of the amazing things to me, and I was really astounded that no French orchestra had ever recorded Sibelius symphony cycles, a complete cycle of Sibelius symphonies. And I thought, since I'm Estonian, which is of course a very, very a close country to Finland, and we are kind of practically brothers when it comes to Finns, linguistically and geographically and so on, that probably that could be a good opportunity to be the first one who has recorded complete set of Sibelius symphonies with Orchestre de Paris. And so over the period of 3 or 4 years, we actually did it. I learned a lot from this experience, because one of the things that one always hears is that, well, you have to understand and be from the north to play Sibelius well, or you need to be a Russian to be able to do Tchaikovsky really well, and so on. And this experience with Orchestre de Paris really made me re-evaluate this whole notion that you somehow need to be born into the culture in order to understand the music. And what I found actually so liberating is that Orchestre de Paris who literally never played some of those pieces before, had such a natural and instinctive response to this music and how much they loved it. And for me, some of the questions that I had in the score were answered so naturally and effortlessly by musicians who actually never studied the score, because they reacted to the music they played purely as music, without putting any labels to it, without thinking, well, this is Nordic music, or you have to know the Finnish language, or you have to know the landscape of and the nature of Finland. So this was really one of the most liberating and interesting learning experiences. As a result, I must say, I'm very happy with what we came up with, and I hope you listen to them. They're all available on Spotify and other outlets. So here, the first question. Have you heard the sketches of what have been Sibelius' 8th Symphony? I have a very interesting... No, I have heard the sketches, yes, and I have a story for you. My name is Paavo, and the reason my name is Paavo is because there was a great Finnish conductor, Paavo Järvi, and my parents were very good friends, and they named me after him. So he's kind of my godfather. And once I talked to him in Oslo, Norway, about... at the dinner about the 8th Symphony, and Paavo Järvi told many interesting stories, but he told me that he knew a man who brought back from the printer the plates, the iron plates of the 8th Symphony, and then they disappeared. And if that's the case, and I somehow don't think that Paavo Järvi had any reason to sort of create an untrue myths, then this is epic. It is unbelievable if there actually is something somewhere, probably in the bottom of some Finnish lake nearby his house, a plate with plates with the 8th Symphony. But being that he's so unbelievable self-critical, he probably didn't feel that it was something he wanted the world to see. But to me, that's a dream someday, to be able to discover even a movement of the 8th Symphony. How did Sibelius' passion for nature influence his work? The nature, I think, is maybe the number one influence in his music. Even the titles, you have things like Scene with Cranes and Swan of Tornella, and you have all these he has this particular thing about the birds. And when you are in Ainola and you see the nature, Ainola is the place where he lived, and he lived in a place where a government basically gave him a lifetime stipend when he was a young man, recognizing that he was a very talented person and whose contribution to Finland needs to be supported, so that he wouldn't have to worry about the money. And he built a house in the woods, and he named it after his wife. So Aino was the name of his wife, and Ainola is the kind of villa, and it became, and now still is, a kind of a place of pilgrimage for all the Sibelius lovers, like Valhalla or something like that. And there are a lot of these cranes and swans, apparently, and so on, who he saw flying by. And all these things obviously had an incredible influence on him. I also think that the nature, the influence, should not be taken too literally. Sometimes it is the mood in the music that actually is reflected by his love of nature. It's not necessarily even the sounds of birds but if you listen to, for example, 4th Symphony or the 7th Symphony, you start hearing this slow, this slowly moving bass line, sort of undulating, and you have a feeling that I mean, I immediately see this incredibly large pine forests of Finland. So I hear nature in almost every note, but it's subjective because, of course, I know that nature and I come from around there. Let's see what else. Okay, there are very interesting and a lot of questions. Which of all the symphonies by Sibelius, which one do you like the most and to conduct and feel at heart? You know, it's very difficult. I always end up conducting the famous symphonies. Not always. I conduct others as well, but then on the second and the fifth are the ones who kind of you can always play and not have so much explaining to do to an orchestra, or how does this work and why is this piece so strange and where the phrase is going and so on. I actually love the third. I really love the fourth, and I must say I am very, very, very fond of the sixth. But these are the ones that get the least play because they have a certain enigmatic quality, and also they don't have this triumphant endings, which everybody, all us the applause-loving musicians, all want to end a concert with something very impressive. And the other thing is that if you take a fourth symphony, let's say, in the program, then everything else has to be much easier to put together because the fourth symphony is so complicated, and all these areas that need to be really worked out with the orchestra are such that it doesn't leave so much room for the other pieces. But of course, I mean, if you do a second symphony and you get to the finale, I mean, there is nothing like it. No, it isn't such an epic piece of music. Fifth symphony with this unbelievably original and sometimes still puzzling to many audiences. These chords that seem to sort of never end, and people don't know when to clap and when not to clap. But this is fantastic stuff. I mean, I love all of them. Hello, Maestro Paavo. Now it's the middle of night here from Fukuoka, Japan. Well, hello. I'm happy that you are up, and I hope you're safe. Next question. What advice would you give to a young conductor who will conduct the violin concerto? What are the great challenges with the piece? Greeting from Paris. We miss you. Hello, Paris. Sibelius' violin concerto is perhaps one of the most uncomfortable pieces to accompany. I could seriously advise you to have a father who is a conductor. He will tell you how to do that. That's what happened to me. And I must say, the advice that he gave me when I was younger, and we went through this piece note by note, still comes in incredibly handy every time I have a pleasure of conducting Sibelius violin concerto. There are so many little corners that one need to really agree with a soloist. The orchestral music and orchestral parts are never just accompaniment. It's always equally important to the solo violin line and has a symphonic quality, and one needs to always look at the dynamics in a way where dynamics are agogic. It is not ever absolute in any concerto, but it also depends on the sound and the interpretation of the view of the soloist. But very often the biggest issue is making sure that the orchestra is present and yet not overpowering the soloist. And this is something that in many performances can go really wrong because the texture and the way it is written, it can be quite overwhelming. But the other thing is, of course, tempi. It's important that there is a really good agreement with the soloist on the choice of tempi. For example, the finale, the second most gorgeous movement, the second movement of the violin concerto. That is something where you really need to. I advise to go to your clarinet, your flute players, your oboe players, and sit down with them, not in the rehearsal, but in the break or after rehearsal, and really talk it through and sing it through, because it is something that needs to float in the air and have a total consensus when it comes to how to play these lines and how to connect these opening little duets. So a lot of these will fall in place. Use as much alla breve, and don't beat everything in 6 what you can conduct in 2. And then you need to know when to go back in 2, because it can get orchestra needs a lot of information, and especially when music is slow. Greetings from Canada. Could you possibly share how you study your score when you get the score for the first time? And do you have a different approach towards score studying in different composers? Every time I get a brand new score, let's say a music that is just written and composer just finished the score, that is, I always have a little bit of kind of slightly nervous excitement, because we don't know what to expect, and that's very exciting. At the same time, we also are not looking forward. I'm never looking forward to kind of surprising, especially when it comes to notation. I must say that I am not always confident about, at least at this point anymore, how much time I want to spend on learning an entirely new language, where all the musical science and language issues that we've studied and learned in school, and where are sort of not valid, and you have to start learning, a language of numbers and aleatoric signs and all kind of things. To me, that is something that always puts a little bit of fear in my soul. But on the other hand, I have also had to do that, and some of it can be very interesting. But when I take a score that I don't know and a music I don't know, I go through a very basic steps. First, I just open the score. I take a look what the orchestration is. I sort of look at the pages and see what's the first impression, and then slowly you start looking. How many movements, how large is the orchestra, what type of musical language that is. After that, you need to start narrowing things down. I always take movement by movement. I try to somehow organize the piece. And if you don't know the piece at all, then you might not realize that how things relate. So you start slowly getting to know each movement, each segment, each little nuance, each little rhythmical. What I noticed, this comes here and this comes back here. So there must be some connection. So you make some notes. And slowly you have a kind of a roadmap for yourself. And that is very subjective. Everybody does it differently, and everybody should do it differently. But basically, you have to create some sort of a roadmap, some kind of a plan. Like when you go into a forest, or you go somewhere, people used to have these maps, and these maps, not like a GPS, but a real map where you can say, okay, now basically I know what's happening, so now let's zero in and get to know even smaller area. And this zeroing in continues, and then you see how the next movement, you do the same thing, see how it relates to the first. and try to sing, try to play it on the piano, try to imagine how this sounds, how these sounds are going to sound in real time, actual life, and imagine, if you have more experience, the better, because experience teaches you, what the combination of sounds and rhythms are. But it is really my basic suggestion is try to create some sort of a roadmap for yourself, and go from very large, and then start zeroing in smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, until you then get into really minute details and saying, well, the same exact passage, here one had a slur, here he doesn't have a slur. Is that a mistake? Is that a conscious decision? If the composer is alive, call him up and say, listen, is that a mistake? If it's somebody you can't call, then try to put a question mark, try to find an intelligent solution, and you can always change it later. It's always a question. The best thing is also talk to your friends, talk to the people who have done the piece. More you listen, the better as well. But if you have a world premiere, of course, just go step by step. Next question. Okay, there's a lot of questions here. Very nice to see so many of you tuning in. What is the difference between Sibelius Violin Concerto and Violin Concerto of other composers? What is the special point of Sibelius Violin Concerto? Well, I think that it's one of the most original, one of the most theatrical, dramatic, violinistic. Sibelius was a great violinist himself, or I don't know how great he was, but he was a good violinist, and he knew the violin, and he loved writing for violins. And if you know things like Humoresques, the Serenades, a lot of other violin music that he wrote, which is sort of very charmingly old world and very beautiful, and has these nuances of true sort of old violin nuances that only a violinist would know how to do. Then you realize what an epic work that is. I think it's hard to compare with other music, because it's not really. There's no point in comparing with other violin concerti, because if you look at the great ones of Brahms, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Sibelius, what else? I'm missing probably something else, but they all are such epic and unusual and iconic works that they need to be seen, not intrinsically. They need to be seen in a way that is not in comparison to others. But Sibelius, I've heard great violinists say things like, well, Sibelius has a problematic work because, of course, it's a big problem with form. One of the great star violinists recently said that, and of course, it's nonsense. There is no problem with form, and there is no there is no problem with form. You just have to know Sibelius's other music to understand his language, and then you stop comparing the form to the other concerti, and if something doesn't coincide with it, then calling it weak or calling it a problematic form. It is just a problematic understanding. That person just doesn't know Sibelius. She just only knows the one piece, and that one piece needs to be seen in the context of the entire Sibelius output. But one thing he did know, he knew violin, Sibelius, and he knows how to use the violin. He was good enough. He auditioned for Vienna Philharmonic, believe it or not, which is an interesting thing, and he wasn't accepted. But the fact that he had confidence to actually go and audition for Vienna Philharmonic, that says a lot. That says a lot about his own idea of how good he was and how much he loved violin. Let's see. What is the next question? One of the most memorable, the question is, what is your most memorable Sibelius performance? Is there a YouTube link of it available? One of the things that I still remember, and I always loved, was the second symphony with Orchestre de Paris. We did a live. There should be a link on YouTube, or is maybe also in Mezzo. But the second live with Orchestre de Paris, I think they played it exceptionally well, and I do remember this very vividly. The other memorable performance, which I don't think I'll ever forget, was the Kullervo performance now in Tonhalle in Zurich. In fact, it was the very first time that Tonhalle Orchestra in Zurich has ever played the piece. And to me, that was something really epic, because it was also an opening concert as a new music director of the orchestra, and it was a very special occasion to begin with. But the way the orchestra played, and with such unbelievable commitment, I don't think I will ever forget that. And even the fact that even in Switzerland, where this music is not so well known, and Kullervo is played very seldom, the audience somehow seemed to have gotten the point of the piece and were extremely enthusiastic. So maybe these two I can certainly recommend. All right, another friend. Not long ago, I had a chance to compare solo violin part and the score of Sibelius Violin Concerto, initial version, and much more frequently performed revised version. In general, initial version, in my opinion, it's much closer to Sibelius' original musical language. But of course, we all got used to the second revised version, and when we hear the original, sometimes we feel a little uncomfortable, especially if somebody is listening for the first time. Yes, there is a very good recording available with Leonidas Kavakos, where he does both versions, and it's very that's an interesting question to begin with, because when composer revises something, often there are two radically different approaches. One group of people says, well, no, this is not as good as the original. Talking too much right here. And then the other another group of people, and I belong to the other group of people, who thinks that whenever a composer revises something, even if it is under totally unmusical circumstances and conditions, for example, like Prokofiev or Shostakovich had to revise certain things because of the pressure of Soviet authorities. I think that when a composer revises something, it's always better. Mahler said, revise until the end of your life. Always revise, always improve things. For that reason, for example, I conduct the revised version of the Fourth Symphony of Prokofiev, and some people feel that it is not really an original thought of Prokofiev, but he revised it under the intense pressure of a Soviet government. It may be so, but I think that if the composer revises something, he makes it better, and there is a more mature and more perhaps interesting take on that piece. Speaking of revision, my very good friend Erkki Sven Tür just recently premiered his first symphony, which he withdrew after the premiere, I think maybe 30 years ago or even more, and now revised it. And the premiere was given maybe a month ago or not so long ago. And we had a conversation about it, and it was very, very interesting. And I heard it also very interesting what he said. He said that I knew exactly what I wanted to write when I was young, but I just lacked the tools and know-how to really express it. And now I am just making this music much more clear and much more convincing because I know more, but the original idea still remains. So I am one of the maybe not so many people who actually likes the revised versions more. Next. Thank you, Maestro. Will you have an Alpine Symphony next time in NHK Tokyo? Yes, well, this is such a pity that because we were supposed to do Alpine Symphony now before the whole world shut down. And I certainly hope that we are going to do the Alpine Symphony and reschedule it in a way that the same program. In fact, the Alpine Symphony was also going to be paired with the Josef Legende, which is another wonderful piece not often played. So yes, we will hope to reschedule it somehow, but when exactly, that remains to be seen. How would you compare how a composer hears music in his mind and how you do when reading a score? How you do when reading score? Oh, it's very hard to tell. I don't know. I know that I have been in close contact with very many living composers who have always, without a fail, corrected something and made certain adjustments to the score once they hear it live. And one thing, of course, is hearing it sort of in your mind. The other thing is hearing it when you actually hear people playing it, and a lot of nuances can be adjusted. I don't know the answer to this question. I know that there is, in today's technically advanced age, one of the things that majority of the composers now do, they create MIDI files of their music basically to check that all the harmonics and everything that they wrote actually sounds and it's in the right transposition and everything is in order. In other words, that there are no mistakes in parts and so on. But even then, the true color can only be seen and heard when the actual musicians play it. For me, pretty much, I see it with a bit more distance than a composer, because composer had an idea to write it. For me, I am learning somebody else's ideas, and the person, you can't get that deep into the inner world of another person. You have to either talk to them or you have to let the music actually sound, and then have an impression of what it is. Recently, we premiered with Stefan Dohr and Berlin Philharmonic the new horn concerto by Abrahams, and the things that I studied it for a very long time, and the things that were in that score and the revelation of talking to a composer and the little details that he brought out and little quotations. Okay, this comes from Mozart concerto. This comes from here and there. They literally made the piece for me, and without knowing these details, I wouldn't be able to understand what it is. So little bits and pieces help. What composer hears in their mind and what I hear in their mind, I have no way of knowing how to. Next. Interesting question. I love the recordings of complete Sibelius symphonies that your father recorded, and your recording with Orchestre de Paris, obviously. How does it feel to listen to each other's interpretations? Much of what I know about Sibelius, or the way I came to Sibelius, is well, the way I came to pretty much anything in music and everything in music was through my father. So there was no Sibelius for me before my father's Sibelius, so to speak, and before we discussed music and discussed Sibelius and the symphonies we have all gone through. And so to me, one of my favorite Sibelius interpreters is obviously my father, and I'll explain to you why. Because this music, and that's a very touchy subject, because one of the reasons why I need to put it in a way that it makes sense. One of the reasons why we hear a rather different and rather a stylistically I would say more economical, emotionally economical version of Sibelius symphonies that are often coming from Finnish conductors and Finnish interpreters, and then you would listen to Sibelius conducted by non-Finns and Central European people and Americans and so, and you hear a little bit a different approach, a different sound world. And one of the interesting currents that have gone through Sibelius interpretation, interpretive music, interpretive art, is that there came a point, and has a lot to do with the Finnish independence, and very much we relate to this because Estonian independence is the same thing. I mean, we also have a strong sort of nationalistic desire to be separate from Russians and separate from the kind of a great Russian neighbor that has been quite an oppressing neighbor at times, well, throughout the history actually. And so Sibelius, when you listen to Finns, and I love a lot of my Finnish colleagues and their work, but you can hear that they somehow almost trying to make a point that no, this music is not like Tchaikovsky, and it is not influenced by Russian music, and it's purely Finnish, and it has to have this kind of directness and the type of it should not have any kind of Slavic influence, and in fact it shouldn't have any Germanic influence either. And let's face it, I mean, all of this it's a wishful thinking, because we all know that Finland and Finnish music and Estonia and Estonian music for that matter, but everybody has been influenced by the music around them, and you cannot take away the influence of Russian music and Tchaikovsky from the music of Sibelius, as you cannot take away the influence of Wagner and Bruckner from music of Sibelius. So the interpretation as such, one has to make a decision. Are you going to treat it as music, or are you going to treat it as Finnish music? I know it sounds a little bit almost absurd now what I'm saying, but I find the kind of the music, if you listen to his violin music and Humoresques, for example, you realize the colors and the old world sentiment that is in these pieces. And if you listen to the symphonies, especially the early symphonies, you also hear that old world sentiment. If you listen to the recordings of Stokowski and Ormandy and Barbirolli and so on, you realize that the sound that was accepted at that time was the old world, beautiful, warm and luscious string sound, and epic and powerful climaxes and so on. And they were not rigid. They were not dry. It's all something that has sort of been superimposed on the music later, and especially by younger Finnish conductors, and by doing this, they also have found an interesting angle. it's also valid. So I'm not necessarily complaining about it or criticizing by any means. I just think that it just shows that there are different approaches. To me, I love the recordings of my father because he treats it as organic music and makes it sound like a one romantic symphony should sound, in a way, rather than a kind of superimposing the extreme Nordic or Balticness or Finnishness, which I think that is an option, but it to me is not an option that I prefer. All right. This is so true about Finland getting freedom at the time when Sibelius was writing his symphonies. You don't really understand the music at all if you don't know about the historical background and the story. I kept going till 1940s. Thank you for this note. Well, yes, historical background is something that helps with any music. I mean, I remember thinking of Nielsen's Sixth Symphony, and first time I heard it, and I thought he must have just gone insane. Something's wrong with him. And later, after reading and exploring more and seeing what was behind it and what was his own reasoning, I totally fell in love with the piece. But one needs to know and have a kind of a crutch a little bit. It helps some little hints in the writings of the composer or the historic background of the time when the person wrote something certainly helps, and it could turn your view of the piece totally upside down, which is something that now is for me a part of every score study. You have to learn about the time that the composer was writing. More questions? Thank you. All I can say, thank you. Very nice for you to join. Oh, some friends from Cincinnati. Can you briefly touch and talk about Sibelius' powerful connection and exploration of folk and myths in his music? One amazing thing about Sibelius is that you kind of go through the entire Finnish prehistoric and epic history. You can go through all of that and get to know it through the music of Sibelius. I mean, if the first large-scale symphonic work he wrote, an Opus 7, if I'm not mistaken, is Kullervo, and he was a very young man, something like 19 or 20, and he wrote a piece that lasts an hour, employs a male chorus, two soloists, one movement is entirely in 5. I mean, you have to kind of, if you put it in a context and see what an audacity it took for a young man to write a piece like this, you realize that he from early on had a very strong idea already who he was, which is an interesting question and different subject for another conversation, because I think that all great people and all great composers know from very early on the true value and sort of standing in historical terms. But if you look at Kullervo, there is an epos, an epic, called Kalevala, a Finnish Kalevala, and there are these two quite interesting characters. One is Kullervo, and the other one is Lemminkainen. And so one is a kind of a sunny boy, a hero. Another one is a sort of, always people ask, well, what do you think? Is Kullervo a hero or a villain, or is he a good or bad character? And it's very hard to tell, because all great characters and all great villains have what makes them often so great and engaging is the positive side, the warm side, the good side, and any great actor playing a villain always makes you sort of fall in love with a character, even though you know you shouldn't. And that's what makes all the great actors who play villains, really engaging. The positive side of evil, so to speak. Kullervo is a guy who basically, was captured with his mother and with his whole tribe, and the tribe was captured by a rival tribe, making things quite simplistic here, and everybody was killed, but the mother was left alive, and Kullervo was left alive, and he escaped, and he basically on his way back met a woman, and he tried to seduce her, and did seduce her, and then after the epic love scene, which is in the third movement, they start talking, and they say, by the way, who are you? And they find out that they are brother and sister. And so this is, I mean, imagine a young composer choosing this subject matter of all the things he could have chosen as the first piece, and in incest, and then the death, the sister walks herself to the river, is the right text, which means she drowns herself. And Kullervo, after winning a battle, and then has a very serious conversation with his sword. This is exactly the words in the text. And the sword gives him some advice that why don't you kill yourself? And then at the most epic moment, Kullervo, in the words say, leans against his sword, which is a very epic and poetic way of putting that he kills himself. But anyway, it is from that to Lemminkainen to En Saga to almost every other piece. Even symphonies can be somehow, you could see a certain glimpses of a kind of prehistoric Finnish runo singing. So that connection is very, very strong. But and a lot of the tone poems are literally written with the Finnish epic Kalevala in mind. Right, next. Sibelius with Orchestre de Paris and Tonhalle. Do you get the same sound out of every different orchestra? Oh no, absolutely not. And this is what I totally love. I think one of the biggest joys of my work is actually being able to hear the sounds and specific way each orchestra makes music. And it would be incredibly boring and incredibly disappointing that if you would go and play a Sibelius symphony or any other music everywhere, and you get exactly the same approach, same sound. In fact, one of the things that we have been lamenting about in musical world often is discussing is the kind of equalization or globalization, if one could say so, of sound, because we are a global world now, and we are all connected so much closer by the technology and ability to communicate, that we lose sometimes the individuality and individual colors and customs of each place that we are in. And for example, one orchestra that sounds still like nobody else for me is a Czech Philharmonic, because it is certainly has retained a certain sound that is very much suitable for their music. One of the things about Tonhalle is that, and I remember it the very first time I went there, I was immediately struck by this, and I mean it as a biggest compliment. That old world string sound, old world approach to sound, where everything is played through and everything is held a little longer, and where things are, the color and the nuances are incredibly important. And to me, I remember thinking, this is the way some of the older great orchestras in Central Europe must have sounded. A lot of the sound in all orchestras now is more homogeneous, and there are certain reasons for that. Number one, there are many international players in different orchestras, and if you look at a great orchestra like Berlin Philharmonic, you have an American concertmaster, a Japanese concertmaster, principal flute is French, principal oboe is German, and one of those in English, and so on and so on. And so you have such an incredible mix of schools and personalities that, of course, the sound will reflect on that as well. And of course, they have retained this amazing identity and a beauty in their playing. But it isn't the same in today's world. Very few orchestras can say that they sound the same as in the beginning of the 20th century, perhaps. Paris had one wonderful thing about, especially when it came to Sibelius, is that they didn't know that music, and that means they played the way they felt any music needs to be played. And if they felt it's an expressive line, they played it expressively without contemplating too much. Is it right? Is it stylistically correct? Is it something that we're doing correctly or not? They just went with their emotion, and I think that is one of the things that I really, really love about the way they play music is that they go with what they feel, and they don't overthink the sound, because they themselves actually have a very beautiful sound. The other thing I learned from Orchestre de Paris, which I forever and ever am grateful, is how to play French music, because what we have a misconception of French music is transparent and therefore has to be played sort of very, very, very lightly and with a light bow and sort of barely making a sound, the kind of a thing that often in schools we are taught that the French music, well, it has to be transparent. What I learned from Orchestre de Paris is that left hand works over time, all the time, doesn't matter. And the right hand creates nuances which are very much to do, they are painting with the right hand, very much to do with articulation and so on. So you never have an empty and void of color, sound that is void of color, something that very often some of the great orchestras outside of France end up sounding like. They end up sounding a little bit colorless, especially when playing French music, because they think that this is the style. It isn't. Listen to a lot of the French music that Orchestre de Paris plays. They have a gorgeous, full, rich sound, and yet they make it transparent with the right hand. And it is something that I must always remember, and I'm always grateful to them for teaching me this. All right, next. Greetings from Curtis. This is very nice. Yes, very nice that somebody from Curtis listening. That's 3 of most important years of my life. What is your view of how historical events during Sibelius' time, such as World War I, impacted the evolution as a composer? I think that when great events happen, I mean, I think we are actually going and are in the middle of one of the kind of game-changing events of certainly our lifetime. But if we talk about wars and pandemic like now, and certainly great catastrophes, it changes everything. It changes everybody, and not the result or the actual change is not necessarily something that one immediately even notices, but the entire societies are changed, the way societies think, the way the norms of behavior, the norms of acceptance, and so on. So, without a doubt, these great events have impact on creative people, because, of course, they write things. They write things to express their feelings, their own thoughts, their own ideas. I mean, if you look at the Second World War and Richard Strauss, even though we're talking about, I mean, just as an example, you know, when the world was literally falling apart, the Second World War killed more people than any other event in history. And Richard Strauss writes an oboe concerto as if nothing happened. You know, you have this feeling of where have you been hiding? And then some people think that he's just, you know, unaware of the world and doesn't really take part of the world events. And other group will say, well, he didn't want to see the world and he wants to see the beauty. And it's a kind of an answer to his incredible, deeper, profound sorrow to write something beautiful and simple and from an old world, as if all this catastrophe didn't exist. Who knows? You know, I think all I know, and I don't know a good answer for the Sibelius, other than that definitely these events have, you know, profound impact on the composers. And Sibelius, I always, being Nordic and being Baltic, Estonian, I always hear a certain distance, the right way of putting it, an attempt to distance himself from other influences, so to speak. And it never really, at the end, works. His music obviously is very different by the time we get to the 6th, 7th symphony, also forth, you know, from what he wrote when, you know, in the beginning. But at the same time, the language of Sibelius is so clearly evident already from the very beginning pieces that he writes. So, you know, I mean, I have recorded a piece that most of you probably never heard, the only opera that he ever wrote, called Maiden in the Tower. Look it up, it's on Spotify. It's Maiden in the Tower. I mean, this is a kind of a really nice glimpse in a young composer trying to find out which way to go. What are the options? And then he abandons that direction. But the piece itself has a lot of information, and it's very useful for young conductors to actually listen to it, because there's a lot of music in that opera that later on is somehow reworked and appears in other symphonic music of Sibelius. So I think there are changes, but I think the something basic is still already there in the beginning. All right. Next. Interesting question. Could you please address the challenge with the different editions of Sibelius scores, especially symphonies? You've mentioned before that older editions contain corrections from Berglund and other conductors. What about Urtecht edition? A very interesting thing about editions in general is that on one hand, one needs to be sure that the text is by the composer and the composer's you know, utterances are clearly documented in a correct way. Having said that, if you look at a lot of the newer editions of not necessarily Sibelius, but many other composers, you find that the older editions have incorporated a lot of markings and corrections from conductors who were present in the beginning of the creation of the work. So if you look at the Nielsen symphonies, I personally conduct them all from the old editions, Hansen's edition, because a lot of the corrections and a lot of the things that are missing in the new Urtext don't make any sense. And I think that these corrections were even put in with Nielsen himself being present and agreeing to them. So this is it's a judgment call, because on one hand you really need to have a text and confidence that this actually is what Sibelius wrote, because it's very hard to there's no point in looking at somebody else's interpretation of his music. At the same time, most of the conductors would be very well served by looking at the scores of other conductors. If you look at the score of Bernstein and let's say of Sibelius Symphony, you can see that it's all remade, redone. The dynamics are redone. The balances are all different. And in fact, that is a standard. This is what the conductor's work is. So blindly looking at something and saying, well, he has a forte here, we need to play this forte. It's all matter of context, and it's all matter of experience and performing experience. And I always cherish, whenever I can get my hands on the scores of the other great conductors of the past, it's a gold mine. It's something that every conductor can learn from, and especially if you look at people who actually were in close contact with the composers. At the very end, you need to make up your own mind. I would definitely conduct from the new Urtext score, but then I would add certain things which maybe are omitted there, and the score actually is very good because they are putting things that are not clearly Sibelius in brackets, so you could make a decision and and use your judgment. Why somebody has opted, for example, in Nielsen symphonies to add timpani or add sforzati in the scores, where in the Urtext you don't. I am not sure. I do things at the end which seem right to me after a lot of consideration, but new Urtext edition would be a good starting point. Hello from Estonia. Which is your favorite Sibelius cantata and why? Well, this little thing up here. See, let me do this. Right here. See, this little toy is a Grammy, and this is actually one of the important, very nice memories of a Sibelius cantata recording that we did with Estonian National Orchestra, with Ellerheim Chorus and RAM, Estonian National Male Chorus, and one of the ideas of the project is to put all the smaller choral pieces on one disc and see what happens, basically. Because as a disc collector myself, I always wanted to have one of those discs. I always wanted to have a disc where all these small vocal pieces by Sibelius written for choruses are all in one place. And I cannot tell which my favorite is. I listened Maan Virsi today actually, and I forgot how beautiful this music actually is and how beautifully the chorus is singing there. So check it out if you're interested. See, the album is called Sibelius Cantatas, and it's on Erato. Next. This is a very complicated and very specific question. I think that we don't really have time to do particular score study here per se. When it comes to editions go with a new Breitkopf. It's a very, very good edition. But now let's see what's next. Which version of the Fifth Symphony do you find the most persuading? Which one is your favorite? I still love the one with Bernstein and Wiener Philharmonic. Somehow Bernstein Bernstein always had this ability to make things even grander than they are. And his capacity for epic climaxes is something that is unmatched to me by anyone. And so I would say Bernstein. But having said that, there are many others I could mention. Very different approaches. Bernstein would be my favorite, but also it's the sound of the Wiener Philharmonic, which will adds to this sort of strength and inner expression and power. Hello, Ingrid. Let's see. There are a lot of questions. Oh my God, I don't think we're gonna get through this, but we'll try. We have nowhere else to go. We are very faithfully here, sitting and distancing ourselves, but these questions are very interesting. Thank you for tuning in. Greetings from Hungary. Heard you in Budapest with the Tonhalle Orchestra. It was fantastic. Thank you very much. I love Hungary and Hungarian music, and we love coming back there. This is one of the great musical cultures. Charles Coleman, have you performed Sibelius Tapiola? Hi, Charles. Sibelius Tapiola I have performed many times, and most recently it was with Berlin Philharmonic, and it's I think on Digital Concert Hall, and this is an unbelievable piece. And you know why I love this piece and why it was my dream to do it with Berlin Philharmonic? Because the first time I've ever heard this piece was on the record conducted by Karajan and Berlin Philharmonic, and that was such an epic performance. And of course, hearing this great orchestra just really play, it was a most memorable moment. And so I thought someday, as a small boy, I thought someday, if I'm lucky enough to conduct this orchestra, I would definitely like to perform it there as well. And my dream came true. Any advice for conducting students that can't practice with real orchestra? Yeah, this is a very good question, and a question that many people and many of my students and friends ask me. And one of the misconceptions is that conducting an orchestra, you need to have a large orchestra. What you need is 4 people. You need 5 people. If you're lucky and you have more than 5 friends, get 6 people. Get any people you can get together, buy them pizza afterwards, and don't forget the beer. The thing is that musicians will react to your conducting and your gestures exactly the same way. If there's 4 people or 40 people or 80 people, and if you really want to learn and practice conducting and learn how effective your gestures or clear your gestures are, get some friends together and do a little music party, and this is only after. Make sure you sit 2 meters apart, of course, and wear masks and rubber gloves. But other than that, your friends will be as helpful in learning conducting, because you don't need a big orchestra. And I will challenge anybody to get through either Soldier's Tale or Dumbarton Oaks some of the most complicated pieces to conduct, and some of the most educational pieces to conduct. So get 8 people of your closest friends together and do a reading of Soldier's Tale. This is the way you could benefit without having a large orchestra. Hello, John Palmer. I'm so happy that all my friends are joining in. Do you consciously conduct a piece differently for studio recordings versus a live performance that is to be subsequently released, as in Paris Sibelius, as opposed to normal live performance? Well, actually, not consciously. I never tried to consciously do different things in a recording or concert, but the reality is that always the live concert feeling and character and attitude and the chemistry and the energy and all the things, it always is better. It almost, if you have audience, and I can't over emphasize this point, is that we play music for people. This attitude, and some of the people I've heard saying that, well, I don't care, I play for myself and I enjoy it. Fine, but if you have even 5 people sitting in the audience, you play differently. And if you have a sold out house, it simply cannot be fabricated in a studio. You might have a certain amount of precision, certain amount of clarity, a lot of things that could be better in a studio. But the feeling of actual process of making music, the organic development, and also the knowledge that you cannot stop and do another take and have one more go at a difficult passage or whatever. This intensity and energy, this is something that cannot be matched by any studio recording. So no, I don't consciously conduct differently, but it always ends up being different and better when it's live. Last time you talked about good conducting technique, breathing, clarity, and so on. Could you develop a little, please? Well, conducting technique, I don't want to get too specifically into it, because that for that you need to come to the course in Pärnu. But the main thing is that people need to breathe. All people, not only wind players, but all human beings need to breathe. Breathing is the key for our existence. But at the same time, we also need the breath to be able to prepare and create the character of what the music that's about to be played. And so if somebody just gives you a downbeat and says, why are you not together? And why is this too loud? And why is there an accent? Well, it's because we can't breathe before you don't give us time to prepare. The same thing with the string. And the sound has everything to do with the way you breathe, the way you prepare. And it's called Auftakt, and upbeat technique. The Auftakt technique is the thing that I grew up hearing at home from my father, and I cannot emphasize how important the upbeat and breathing while inviting people to play is. But for more specific kind of hands-on advice, one needs to, of course, come to a masterclass or a course. And I hope that this summer, and hopefully also in Tornhalle and in Pärnu, in the Pärnu Music Festival in Estonia, our festival has a very, very nice conducting academy, and I hope you take part. And in Estonian question, I translate here. Tere. The question basically is, does performance of Beethoven's music if you compare it with Tchaikovsky or Sibelius, for example, is the tempo and the tempo relationships, and tempo needs to be observed more rigidly and more correctly, and more of a framework than a rubato and free-flowing music of Sibelius and Tchaikovsky. I think that basically the choice of tempo basically is the number one most important decision you make as a conductor on the podium, and the tempo is never rigid. The impression of Beethoven's tempo being extremely, how should I say, metronomical and so on, is just an impression. The tempo fluctuates, tempo is very free. All music, the tempo is fluctuating all the time. And the goal of music is never to just remain within a certain metronomical boundaries. But the impression of rhythmic clarity and precision is different in a classical music than it is in romantic music, and so the approach needs to be a little bit different. I think that there is nothing worse than a kind of performance of a Beethoven symphony that feels rhythmically sluggish. But if we really start thinking about rhythm and the inner sort of framework of any music, I think that rhythmically sluggish performance of any romantic performance is also piece is also not really acceptable. So I think there's just different way you approach rhythm, but rhythm in itself is like our skeleton. It keeps our body together. It keeps the form, and it keeps us from sort of falling apart in different directions. So I think basically just it depends very much on your what is the stylistic framework of the work. Greeting from Japan. I was so impressed your opinion that Mahler's 7th Symphony is outstanding because it's almost postmodern. As for Sibelius, how do you describe those charms of his symphonies? Well, if you start listening the 4th Symphony of Sibelius in the beginning for the first time, I mean, one doesn't know what is going on, and usually when you hear it sort of out of context without knowing other Sibelius music, you don't know where to hold on, and in a way you only realize the true genius of this work if you know the rest of his music or the other symphonies and other orchestral pieces and instrumental pieces as well, because his capacity to have a totally sort of traditional framework for the piece and harmonic framework and so on is well documented in the first and second symphonies, but also in his tone poems, and you can understand what the harmonic language and the rhythmical language is there. And then you go to the fourth, and you don't, none of it somehow seem to make sense in the beginning. It's as if you are looking at some kind of a film of sort of psychological thriller of Tarkovsky or something like that. And then all of a sudden there comes a point, and it comes after enough study or enough listening, when you start finding things attractive and you start waiting for these moments to appear, and start realizing how this combination of instruments is actually very beautiful, and how the cello solo and awkward and strange as it is actually very beautiful and actually makes much more sense than in the first listening. So it is a kind of a postmodern music already there, but then you start thinking of the third and the sixth, and all these pieces are little gems. That's for sure. The fourth, I think, is most original. To me, the one that I always look forward to performing most. All right, dear Maestro, I think the string partition of Sibelius Violin Concerto is very sensitive. Concertino, piano, pizzicato. How to have this detail between string and solo violin. It has very much to do with just being very honest and insisting on the right dynamics and really insisting on the orchestra playing what's written. And very often when there is music that is part of color, and then there is music that is part of thematic music, and then there is music that is supportive music to a violin part. So the whole orchestral part needs to be just studied very carefully and really rehearsed before. And one of the things that I'd like to give advice, if I may, to most of my young colleagues and young students is that always rehearse the orchestral accompaniment separately before the soloist comes on stage. So you have once a chance to really work out all the important details. And this goes exactly the same way for a Beethoven piano concerto or a Mozart piano concerto or a Schumann cello concerto or any concerto. Because musicians have this, sometimes they think, well, we know this piece, we played this a lot. That's exactly where you need to have a rehearsal so that there is no automatic pilot. And the orchestral accompaniment of the great solo works sometimes are so intricate on their own that they deserve the attention. And it's always better for performance if you have a little bit of time. Take 30 minutes end of the first or second rehearsal and play through. The soloist will appreciate it as well. Hello, there is another friend. What qualities do you look for a soloist for a collaboration of standard repertoire like Sibelius? Well, you know, I have been very spoiled, I must say, and very, very lucky to have a great pleasure to perform Sibelius Concerto with some of the really greatest of living violinists. You know, I've just to give a few, and I don't want to, you know, get into too many names because I know I will forget somebody and I will regret it the rest of my life. But you know, with Janine Janssen, with Lisa Batiashvili, with Kavakos, you know, and Victoria Mulova, many greats, truly greats. And what I always like about these collaborations is what the soloist brings to the piece. So I never insist on my view in the beginning. If I find that there is a younger soloist who maybe doesn't quite know which way to go, then I can step in and say, listen, why don't you try this? Because this might be an interesting, take a little more time here or a bit less there. But if you have somebody like, you know, Hilary Hahn, for example, you know, their take is very interesting because they have experience and they have unbelievable capacity to find something that is uniquely theirs. And so for me, a person who comes in with a very, very strong personal view of the piece, and at the same time, who is a true chamber musician, who a collaborative musician, who is willing to collaborate on stage rather than expects a kind of special servicing, if you know what I mean. These pieces are always collaborative. There is no such thing as a great performance of Sibelius with a soloist standing, 3 meters in front of the orchestra with a back to everybody and just insisting on doing their own thing. That is never going to turn into a musically interesting performance. What a few other things. I don't think we're going to be able to do all the questions this time, but I'm very grateful that you have tuned in. Thank you. Somebody said that they find my conversations interesting and informative. Thank you very much. I'm very happy you feel like this. Thank you for Fantastique in Berlin. Thank you very much for being there. And not Sibelius related question, which other conductors past and now do you admire? Well, I have one advantage of being brought up in a conductor's family. So the knowledge of the kind of history of conducting is quite extensive, because I used to hear about great conductors when I was 5, 6 years old. We knew about Knapperspursch, Furtwängler, Bruno Walters, and you name it. So it's very hard to really pinpoint, because I admire so many of my colleagues, and many have their particular strength and so much. So it's very, in a broad sense, I can't really answer specifically, but there are many people who I do admire. I'm still probably my biggest fan of my father, and I certainly looking in recent history of conducting, I must say that Bernstein probably is still on top of the list. But with so many people, I have learned to admire them. Maybe in the beginning less, and then more later. And I find also the idols change, and with your own sort of maturity, and you appreciate certain people less in the beginning and more later, and sometimes vice versa. So it's very hard to really give you a list of people, but there are a lot of people, my colleagues, that I really admire greatly. All right. Interesting question. How do you feel his music matured over all these pieces, and how are they unique from tone poems of Strauss and Liszt? Sibelius apparently composed his tone poems throughout his artistic career. Interesting thing about tone poems is something that there used to be two genres, if one could say. One was writing symphonies, other one tone poems. And when you look at Sibelius is a great componist, symphonist, I would say, symphonist. Let's put it this way, because 20th century is a kind of an interesting era where it's an end of the symphony, so to speak, and a lot of people were saying that with the Mahler Ninth Symphony, the symphony is pretty much finished, and the Ninth is the greatest symphony by Mahler, and so on. And then we had some composers continue writing symphonies, Sibelius, but also let's say Rachmaninoff, and there are a few others, obviously Nielsen, Prokofiev, Shostakovich. But if we look at the 20th century, it's pretty much the end of the time when the symphonic writing or writing symphonies pretty much came to an end. People write symphonies still, but not to the strictest form of what used to be expected when one said one writes a symphony. Now, a lot of the symphonies are kind of disguised tone poems. Strauss gave up on symphonies altogether and basically wrote all his music in a sort of a tone poem mode, even though Alpine Symphony is a symphony, but it's actually a picture, a large tone poem. Everything that he wrote basically is a big illustrative sound picture of a story, which is a tone poem. Sibelius makes a very clear distinction between this is a kind of for lack of a better word, not certainly by diminishing it, but it's an illustrative music. The music of tone poems is illustrative and illustrating a story, sometimes very specific one. While symphonic music, symphonies, should in theory be rigid and strict in form, and also very, well, not obviously story written. When you get to Sibelius, you know that these lines are quite blurry, because if you look at the Seventh Symphony, I mean, it could almost be a tone poem. If you put the Tapiola together with the Seventh Symphony, it in a way could almost pass for a tone poem. So I think that Sibelius became closer to the kind of idea of writing and recreating the form of symphony. But at the end, he still wrote 7 symphonies. Meanwhile, people like Strauss and Liszt basically only wrote tone poems. So there is a different mindset, I assume. The Sibelius' music changed very seriously and became more enigmatic, and very often when you listen to the later pieces, especially when you look at something like Tapiola, you realize, my God, how far he has gone from the first piece he ever wrote, which was Kullervo, for the orchestra. You know how much the whole spectrum has changed. But I think this is also something that you can see in Mahler and in most composers. You know, maturity is something that certainly is noticeable in most great composers. What else? Who was your conducting teacher at Curtis? Was the most unexpected thing you learned during the studies at Curtis? Which 3 things your most influential time of that? I had 2. I was very lucky, because I had 2 teachers in Curtis. One was Max Rudolph, and he was at 90 years old at the time, and he was one of the most amazing and adorable and wonderful human beings. He was wise. He knew everything. He was incredibly open-minded when it came to the original or the historically informed approach. He was somebody who would know the entire Richard Strauss operas and conduct them by memory, knowing every word. He was very, he was collecting facsimiles and manuscripts, and we always had, when he was already, when things were, weather was cold and he didn't want to come to school, he lived across the street from Rittenhouse Square, which is where Curtis is, and we conducting students would go and take lessons, all of us, in his living room, and there was always coffee, and one of us had to always bring donuts. So that was a most charming and most wonderful, and to this day I remember so many wise and wonderful things that he taught us. He was very different. The other person was also a wonderful teacher, very different, quite strict, Otto Werner Müller, and I also learned a lot from him. And the good thing was that these 2 men were incredibly different. While Max Rudolph was always taking a very pragmatic, practical approach. You had to take a score in, and this week we studied La Mer, and then he would come in and he would say, okay, here it's going to be like this, here we have to do this in 6, here the second line is never heard, there is a famous mistake in the parts that every orchestra will have, so make sure that you correct that. Make sure here is sometimes even things like here is a page turn in the orchestra you should be aware of. You know, very very pragmatic approach of how to take a piece and really gave you a lot of insight into piece. With Müller, there was a very different approach, and that was basically learning how to conduct. And he said, well, if you can conduct this, let's say an introduction of the Second Symphony of Beethoven, if you can conduct that, that means you can conduct all the other pieces that have the similar issues as well. And so we never got through a piece, so to speak, or we never were allowed to conduct the full piece. We only did certain excerpts, but these excerpts were so educational that you knew how to conduct this type of music the rest of your life. So both approaches were incredibly necessary for me because I needed both for them. And the score study analysis and form analysis and harmonic analysis was the main thing that Otto Werner Müller was concentrating on, while Max Rudolph was always a bit more poetic. He said, well, here, you need to feel this, and here make sure that, you give the fourth beat because, the third horn needs it in this particular case, And he was very, very pragmatic on one hand, but also very, he let it flow. So I loved both of them, even though Otto Werner Müller did make us cry regularly in class. But that's a different issue. Most difficult third movement of the concerto to conduct. Well, Bartók second violin concerto, second piano concerto Bartók. What else can I tell you? There are quite separate different difficulties at the Dvorak concerto, violin concerto, last movement. There are many. Many greetings from Germany. Is there an opera you would desperately like to conduct in the future, and why? Yes. In fact, in August, I'm supposed to conduct Carmen, and I'm desperately wanting to conduct it. And I hope that we are by that time back in business so we can actually get to this performance. I'm currently hard at work at the score and keeping my fingers crossed that August is a little bit less restrictive than it is now. Is there a piece of Sibelius that you would like to conduct and you haven't? There are many things that I haven't conducted by Sibelius. Some of the tone poems I haven't conducted yet. But I am sort of working my way through all of them. So I hope before too late, I'll do all of them. Can you also do a Q&A session on Beethoven, please? Thank you. This is a very good idea because I find it more interesting to talk about composers than to talk about me, frankly. So let's have a composer and have a discussion about that. Thank you, Ingrid. You are very kind. I am very happy that you feel that way. Okay. With all the repertoire you have already conducted, which pieces do you still have on your wish list? Greetings from Mexico. Okay, so this is going to be the last answer. I don't know what is the best way to put it. Is it just agreed, or is it some other philosophical name? Maybe some psychologist who are listening could give me an answer to that. But I have a list, a long list of things that I want to conduct. I have conducted a lot of music and I have a large repertoire. But for me, there are so many pieces that I want to do. If I am given enough years to live, because I can't imagine, for example, not doing Tristan, for example, or touching some great choral masterpieces like Elijah, for example. But the list is long and very comprehensive, and I am very pragmatic. I tick off quite a few things, pieces from this list. So gradually I am getting closer to these pieces. But one also has to realize that one lifetime is not long enough to do, and to even once touch, even peripherally, all the great repertoire which I'd like to touch. So one has to make a certain priority list, and that I have done. And so everything now that I do is still on the list, but somehow maybe not the very first things on the list anymore. A lot of it has to do with opera, choral work, some of the great 20th century pieces that I still haven't and still looking forward to conducting. But this is a kind of a dilemma, because I do desperately want to get most of those pieces on the list. There are also certain interesting things that the mindset is changing in a way that there are certain pieces I don't need to do anymore, which is something that I really, I felt when I was younger, I need to do this music. And there are quite a few pieces right now that I don't, if I never conduct again, I'll be totally okay with it. Because priorities change, interests change, circumstances are different. So it's a nice question to end on, because it reminds me that there is still a lot to look forward and a lot of things to do in a time where we are locked down and sitting in isolation. I'm not bored. I have been looking for a lot of interesting pieces on that list, and in a way that keeps me sane. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. It's nice, even though it's a little bit one-sided because I'm doing all the talking, but it's nice to know that you're there. Greetings from China. Just now I got somebody here, but let's do another one soon, and let's see how deep we can get into subject of Beethoven, or perhaps something else. There's something else I want to read you here. There will be an event on CultureNet Facebook page and on my YouTube channel. Something you should all tune in. I'll be talking to the best-selling author Robert Greene on May the 4th. Now, this is going to be very different from what we do now. He has written famous books like Laws of Human Nature, The Art of Seduction. He's one of the giants and one of the great writers. So tune in. It is on the 4th of May on my YouTube channel and CultureNet channel on Facebook. And before that, maybe we'll do another one. Talk about music. I love talking about music. Thank you for being with us. Stay safe and take care of yourself, and stay healthy. Bye.